Good morning. Good morning. Working all right?
Yes.
What are you all doing here? 10:30 and on a Saturday? Oh my gosh. I wondered what happened at 10:30. You know, usually I'm dreaming.
Louder.
I'm usually dreaming, but I got up early for this. So, Iron Mike Corrigan. Iron Mike is my great uncle. So, he's an interesting man. Although I had to research him a bit. Other Chicago characters. I'm going to turn my back on them next. All right. This is the fabulous Lakeshore Drive in about the early 1800s. You can see that it's not real crowded. It's a beautiful thing right along the lake front, which is on the left. And on the right is what's called the Gold Coast. And that's where people like Marshall Field and Potter Palmer and, you know, the Millionaires Row. All right, next. Karen, next. This is in the 30s. Still, you know, I think the 30s, it may be 40s, but I think it's the 30s. And you can see that it's a little more crowded and there are now some buildings. I believe this is looking north and that's the Edgewater Hotel on the right. Next. And this is Lakeshore Drive today. You have the John Hancock building, right, the tallest one there, and for a short time was the tallest tower in the world. Soon replaced by the Sears Tower, which is now something called something else. Navy Pier is that stretch of land on the left. Now, where did that come from? It wasn't there before. It came from a fellow by the name of Cap Streeter. Next. As a result of his work, or lack of work, this section that you see on this map is called Streeterville, which includes Navy Pier, includes a lot of very posh department stores, hotels, and is a lovely place to visit. It's basically all sand underneath it. Next. And this is also on Streeterville. It's the Chicago Water Tower, at least the bottom part of it. And next to that is a building that was owned by Loyola University. It's the Loyola University Chicago campus, where I took some courses when I was in the Jesuits. So I'm pretty familiar with this area. The Chicago Water Tower is the landmark where the Great Chicago Fire stopped. It was also the pumping station for water. So if that had burned down, who knows what would have happened. And I'll show you the other border of the Great Chicago Fire in a little bit. Next. Again, a view of the structures in Streeterville. The John Hancock building in the middle, the Standard Oil building is the white one on the right, and who knows what the other ones are. Next. All right, this is the culprit that built Streeterville. Cap Streeter and his wife had a bunch of people on this boat, which he ran aground. Whether he was drunk and unintentionally or drunk and intentionally, no one knows for sure. But the way the current works on Lake Michigan, it comes from the north, goes all the way down from Wisconsin to Illinois, and curves in Indiana, and curves up north to go to Michigan, and up toward Lake Superior. So it's a big loop of current. A pretty strong current. So when he capsized the boat, it became it was a big boat, as you can see. It became a barrier with the sand deposits that kept coming from the north and building up more and more property, so it became a little island, which he deemed the independent world of Streator. And as a result of that, there were many legal battles, because remember, across the road was Millionaire's Row. They did not want to see a bunch of scallywags taking up space across from them and ruining their view of Lake Michigan. So he was taken to court, he went to court, and the police raided, and there was a gun battle because he had a bunch of his buddies out there. And there were numerous gun battles, and finally he was overcome by about 500 Chicago police men back in the late 1800s. My grandfather was not yet a policeman, but I think somebody named Moss, who was buried in the cemetery in Evanston, John Moss, was a Chicago cop. So I don't know if he's related or not, because I had to do some research on my own family, because they were rather quiet about some of their backgrounds. Next. So here's the plaque in Streeterville honoring, I guess, or saying, at least this was where Cap Streeter lived, and it's kind that it says this eccentric resident who gave Streeterville its name. He was more than eccentric, he was a nutcase. Okay, next. And here, the oddities of George Wellington Streeter. Again, a map of what he accomplished. And at least he got it named after himself. Okay, next. Again, a view looking north on Lakeshore Drive. On the left is the Sun-Times building and the Tribune building. Okay, next. All right, moving on to two characters. On the left is Bathhouse John Coughlin, and on the right is Hinky Dink Kenna. Bathhouse John got his name because as a boy, he was, I don't know what this means, he was a scrubber in the bathhouse. And as a result, he became friends with a lot of politicians. Go figure. And on the right was Hinky Dink Kenna, who owned a tavern, and as a result made a lot of political and police friends, perhaps mob friends. But he was alderman of the First Ward forever, and then when he passed that on, it went to Bathhouse John. So the two of them, the First Ward is where it covers downtown Chicago and the near south side. It is a notorious ward to this day. I lived in it when I'll show you the St. Ignatius Holy Family Church, which are part of the First Ward, where now the University of Illinois Chicago campus is on, and that was they built that by taking Blue Island Avenue, which no longer exists, and they covered that over with whatever they covered streets over. And they built the University of Illinois Chicago campus on that. This disenfranchising all the Greeks that lived there and worked there. And I remember when I was in high school, I used to walk up Blue Island Avenue from St. Ignatius, which I'll show you later. And all these Greek fellows were in these grocery stores and tavernas and whatnot. And they're playing games, board games, and having their coffee, so to speak. Okay. Yeah, it was delightful. They all had to move to Greektown. Little Italy was also in the First Ward, which we'll talk about a little bit more. Next. Oh, that's Hinky Dink again. He's just such a handsome guy with howdy-doody ears. I think he got those from wearing masks. Next. All right, this is the first Chicago amphitheater that no longer exists. This was in in the first ward at the time in the 1800s through part of the 1900s. This is where Abraham Lincoln was nominated to the Republican Party. The Republican Party started north in Wisconsin in a small little town, which I have visited a couple times because there's a golf course up there. But they've got a plaque that this is the first Republican convention, and Lincoln was the first Republican candidate. And the three cities were vying to hold the Republican convention of whatever year it was, 1860 something. What was it?
1860.
Okay, 1860. So the three cities were St. Louis and Cincinnati. Cincinnati, the gateway to the west, the Queen City, where I went to college, and Chicago, and St. Louis. St. Louis was a much more developed city at the time because it was on the Mississippi River and a trade route, and also the true gateway to the west. This is even before the arch that showed the gateway. Okay, so this is important for a couple reasons. One is it held a convention, despite the workings of especially the Cincinnati newspapers, who wrote, some editorial wrote up Chicago as the Windy City. And why would anyone want to hold a convention in that windy city of politicians? It has nothing to do with actual wind. It was the wind from the politicians that they were being critical of. The name stuck, and perhaps the windy politicians also stuck. Okay. All right, these are the Everly sisters. They were not singers. They were madams of the most famous brothel in the United States. They touted themselves as the brothel of the most beautiful women in the United States. And perhaps that's true. It was certainly one of the largest in the United States. Going back to the Coliseum, one of the things that the Coliseum was famous for is Bathhouse John and Hinky Dink held an annual party there. Hinky Dink at his bar would give out free lunches and free beer in exchange for a vote. That's probably illegal, but not back then. As a friend of mine who moved from Chicago to Asheville, North Carolina, thinking it was funny, was voting, and he went up, he voted, and then he turned around and said to the voting judge, "Okay, where's the next line?" And they said, "What do you mean?" He said, "What, you only get one vote down here?" Like, no, that's not right. They kind of threw him out. They didn't quite get the humor, I did. Anyway, they would get politicians and rich people and Skid Row bums all coming to the party for free lunch. And the setup was for certain honored guests, not only free lunch, but a free girl from their brothel, which influenced some votes, I think. All right, next. All right, there is the great Stockyard fire, and the fire commissioner who died in that, and other people who died, and so forth. Iron Mike Corrigan was the hero of the Stockyard fire. He was so famous that for a while, I think it was either the Chicago's American or the Daily News or the Tribune. Back then you had a lot of newspapers. One of them had a comic strip called Iron Mike, which did the exploits of Iron Mike Corrigan. Next. And you can see the Great Stockyard Fire kills the chief, who you saw in the fire slide, and 22 men when this building collapsed on them, and it was a real disaster. The largest loss of firemen in the country at the time, I believe. Next. And I get to use the pointer. Anyway, this is an aerial drawing view. All right, this part.
Mike?
This is the part that burned down and fell, and it tinged this part of the stockyard fires. The stench from the stockyard fires on the near south side was pretty overwhelming, because this stockyard was the largest stockyard in the country, and all the beef were were railroaded in, because Chicago was a hub for the railway. Many railways were coming to Chicago and are to this day. And the cattle went to the stockyard fire. And, the cattle got there many different ways, including even cowboys coming with them. As you can imagine, the slaughterhouse there, for which the novel by Sinclair Lewis was written, that helped to change the behaviors of stockyard fires. There was child labor in them, et cetera, et cetera. So I forget what Sinclair Lewis's novel was, but it was very famous and influential. I should have looked that up. Next. This is the dead from the stockyard fire and the injured. This is only a partial list because this is all I could fit on the slide. Next. So another one from the Tribune. So I think it was the Tribune that had the cartoon of Iron Mike. But they were entombed in a furnace as the falling wall trapped them after the blast in the Chicago fire. Next.
What year was that fire?
1906, I believe. So this is Iron Mike and his attendants. As a retired fire commissioner, of which he was for quite a while, 18 years, I believe. You'll see that in a minute. He got a fire lieutenant or fire captain to chauffeur him wherever he wanted. And as an ex-fire commissioner, he was invited, quote unquote. I mean, he went to all the major fires, probably as a consultant, who knows what, but I remember my grandfather also taking me to some big fires, just to watch the buildings burn. So, this is an important slide because I believe you can see on this car there is a running board. And when he came to see my grandfather, who was his brother-in-law, Iron Mike married Nora Corrigan, my grandfather, Stuart Moss, married Nora Corrigan, both Irish people, although there's a suspicion that my grandfather was truly English, Stuart Moss. And in fact, one family member was doing research on our genealogy, and Moss derives from Dumas. So if you trace the genes back, we're part Jewish and part black, because that's what Dumas was. One of the, I think Stuart's father came from Ireland, and Parnell was the English member of the England Parliament. And my grandfather was named after him. It was John Stuart Parnell, and he dropped the John and went by Stuart P. or S.P. Moss. Okay. The running board is important because when my great-uncle Mike came, and at this time in his life he was pretty old, I was about 10, and he had Coke bottle glasses by this point, but was still a rather imposing figure, and he would say lieutenant or captain, whoever was driving him. Whatever my great-grandson or great-grandnephew wants, I'll do it. So I had to pick people. Next. Oh, okay, this is his obituary. I just wanted to point out that he did die, no matter how great he was. Okay, next. Iron Mike was the fire commissioner on the bottom from 1937 to 55. The mayors there, he had 5 different mayors. It's interesting, Martin Kennelly ran against Richard J. Daley in 1952. And my grandfather was a rarity. He was a Republican representative of the Republican Party, a staunch Republican, and you know that Chicago is staunchly Democratic. My grandfather was against the machine and against Harry Truman. So when General MacArthur was flying back, when he was called back to Washington by Truman to get fired, Orchard Field was the airport in Chicago, hence ORD for O'Hare Airport. And they would fly over my house when they took off. So, and they'd be relatively low because we only lived, as the crow flies, only lived 3-4 miles from the airport. So at night you got to see them with the landing lights still on and so forth. Everybody knew when MacArthur's plane was taking off from Orchard Field, which was kind of a military airport, I believe, to Washington. It was dark at night, and my grandfather, I was at the time probably about 7 or 8. We went out to the backyard to watch MacArthur's airplane fly over the house on the way to Washington, and I was told to salute as my grandfather did. So we're sitting in the backyard in the middle of the night, saluting the airplane that MacArthur was on. I shall return. Okay, next. All right, back to Iron Mike and the car. Next. Remember, this has got the running boards. This is my class. I'm somewhere in the back because it was 12, so I couldn't identify myself. But you notice the boys all had ties. Regardless of what kind of shirt they had, you have to have ties. Next. All right, so in this class we had 53 students and 1 nun. It's kind of a wonder we got educated, but the nuns, I mean, they certainly had discipline. And I frankly was bored out of my mind at most of the classes. Fortunately, I had the type of memory that as I was daydreaming out the window watching the clouds and thinking cloudy thoughts and whatever, and the nun would be talking about something and then say, Fred Hansen, what did I just say? And I could replay the last sentence that she said, typically in my mind, and I could answer much to the frustration of the nun, who knew I wasn't paying attention at all. And my ties, by the way, were my grandfather's ties, and I was forbidden to wear they were hand-painted, many of them. I was forbidden to wear the one of the nude lady. My mother just didn't understand. So out of this group and some neighborhood kids, the Protestants, this is a Catholic school, obviously, the Protestants even knew, and some of them were okay, we thought. So I would pick them, and we would all stand on the running board of Great Uncle Mike's car, and the lieutenant or captain would turn on the lights and the siren, and we would ride through the neighborhood. And it was a great thrill. And you can't do that today with kids. There's no sense of adventure. We ran into something on the running board. And then I'd come back and get the next crew who were waiting. I was very popular for a moment or two. The next. All right, now we get to the moss. My grandfather's on the lower left. His 5 sons, all of whom became police captains. The second from the left is my godfather, uncle. The third from the middle one is my uncle Ed, who was my godfather. He will come up in another story. The middle one and the lower thing is Jack Moss, who I'll talk about a little later. He left the police department to become a lawyer. I guess a really successful lawyer, which is not surprising because Chicago is kind of who you know there. So, and on the right is my cousin, who's 6 weeks older than me, Bill McCory, who later became a captain. In fact, he was the first captain who was made captain by his exams and performance reviews. And after him, it was political appointments. So I don't know if he would have been politically appointed or not, but he was the last captain without a political sponsor. My grandfather, one of my dads, joined the police force, but he was a Norwegian roofer. And he was in, and I could have put a slide in, but I wanted to keep it on the Irish side of the family. My father's father, who died when I was little, and my grandmother had died before that on the Norwegian side. So all I had was my father and some Norwegian aunts. And my father spoke a little bit of Norwegian. My Norwegian aunts were fairly fluent, but back then, nobody taught the next generation the language, which is unfortunate, although Norwegian is not exactly the most useful language in the world. But it's kind of a pretty language. You know, it's very musical. Skadai means I love you, that's all I know. Okay, so Billy McCory and I were close. We were on the same softball teams and basketball teams and so forth. Frankly, with all humility, I was a much better athlete. But when we would go to my grandfather's house, the bottom drawers of his shift robe. You know what a shift robe is? Yeah, okay. I've been looking for one like this, but I've not found one yet. It's too late, so. But on the bottom shelf, bottom two shelves, I believe, were all guns, ranging from Derringers to buntline specials, because back in his day, when you arrested somebody, the gun was evidence. And if he got convicted, and perhaps even if he didn't get convicted, you keep the gun. So he had probably 3 or 4 dozen guns in his drawers. And Billy and I would pick a gun and crawl around the apartment and shoot at each other, you know, playing cops and robbers or whatever, cops and cops. Now this is not the only members of the family who became policemen. And I have a cousin, John Devereaux, another Irish name. John Devereaux married my mom's sister, Mary Moss. And John and his big brother, Jimmy, who I went to school with, he was 2 years older than me at St. Ignatius, both became policemen, and they were topped off as police lieutenant, which is still a rather significant job. John has been doing research on my grandfather and has had a couple other relatives. The last Chicago police person in my family is Susan Moss, who I remember changing her diaper and babysitting for her when she was little. She was Eddie Moss's daughter. And the other daughter married a policeman who died. And he also had a son, Tommy Moss, who was a Chicago policeman, who was an alcoholic and I think may have killed himself, which is not untypical of policemen. So we got Susan Moss as the last standing Chicago figure from my family. And I found that out from one of my closest friends who was in the neighborhood, that she was a commander which was the equivalent of captain, but it was a step above captain, so you had a whole new layer of people. And I think that was because they changed the rules on appointing the top person, so they created commanders. These guys would have been equivalent to commanders because there were none in those days. And we'll get back to Eddie Moss. Let's see, we'll go down the list. It's from the right, Phil Moss, who was quiet, didn't have any kids, but was a real gentleman. He was in the Army. Let's see if I can get this thing to work. Oh, I can't. He was in the Army on the right, and I think legend had it in the family he was in the ski patrol over in Europe during the war, when they all wore white and so forth, which is kind of astounding because the Chicago in the area is flat as a pancake. So how he learned to ski is beyond me, but maybe he was just athletic. Next to him is John Moss, who plays a pretty central figure in this story. That's John there. And that's Eddie, my godfather. When I was working in the inner city, John was the captain of the police department that incorporated where I lived. And there's a few stories about that. And Eddie was the other one. So for 16 hours a day minimum, one of my uncles was in charge of the police station there. And I was a Jesuit, so Johnny Moss was a Jesuit in 1929 for a year. So he felt a special bond to me with the secret code, etc. of the Jesuits, which they didn't share that with me, so I don't know it. Although I know some things that are privileged. Anyway, Eddie. I'll get back to Eddie and John. This is Paul, another quiet one. And he had 5 people in his family. None of them became cops. And Jimmy Moss had just 2 kids. Now, Jimmy Moss was, for a while, either sergeant or lieutenant in charge of juvenile. As such, he would arrest kids with fireworks or families with fireworks that were illegal in the city limits. And he had a lot of fireworks by the 4th of July. He would put on a fireworks display in our neighborhood. Again, gathering a crowd of kids. Then we had flares and all kinds of things, the rockets that he'd shoot up in the air. So we had our own 4th of July display right in the neighborhood from fireworks that he had stolen, or not stolen, I'm sorry, took. Next. This is John Moss when he was a little bit younger. Next. And this is when John Moss married Violet Gentile, or Gentile. I never quite understood. The Gentile family, rumor had it, was affiliated in some loose way with the mob, as were, in my neighborhood, there were a lot of mob people, and I'll tell a couple things about that. And this is John's sister Eileen. My mother's not in there, but you can see the dress, which starts there and goes all the way across. They probably had 3 people positioned after the photo. How she walked, I have no idea. But they were a very aristocratic, wealthy family, and I'm not sure what the Gentile family did to make as much money as they did. But Joe Gentile was a huge benefactor to St. Ignatius College Prep, where I went to school and taught, and where every everybody in the back row, and all the policemen except for Paul Moss and my cousin Billy McCory went to St. Mel's. So they were a little bit outcasts. Next, rumor has it they couldn't qualify to get accreditation. This is my grandfather, very dapper man, and I remember his hat was always just so. And I mean, he would make sure it was just so before he put it on. And, you know, just a consummate police officer, a consummate grandfather. He was one of my, he still is one of my heroes and idols, but he also had some eccentricities that I'll tell you. My wife already spilled the beans at her morning group. Anybody here from her morning group?
Yeah.
You want to, I'll let you tell her story. No? Okay, next. All right, Leopold and Loeb. This was the perfect crime crew. They were both University of Chicago students, and they thought they were brilliant and that they could pull off the perfect crime if they killed somebody who they had no motive whatsoever to kill, just random, and they, you know, studied all these things. And my grandfather, as a police sergeant, was assigned to the state's attorney's office and was the prime investigator for this criminal act. And they found something at the scene, I think it was a handkerchief or something. It was before DNA, but he found something that led them to Leopold and Loeb. Very wealthy, bright, privileged students who went to jail.
I read the book.
You remember the name of the book?
I don't
Okay.
remember.
And, well, there's a book written about it, and there's two references, I understand, to the red-headed sergeant, which is my grandfather. He had the same kind of hair I do, which turned white. My brother, who's 10 years older, as an aside, inherited the Norwegian genes. So he and my father never really went gray. They were salt and pepper, what they call salt and pepper. And, you know, we argue about what's more distinguished, my white hair. Anyway, next. There we go. Okay, my grandfather was also one of the first on the scene. Some say he was the first on the scene of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre obviously happened on St. Valentine's Day, February 14th. And they came in representing themselves as policemen. And some had uniforms, obviously, some were plainclothes, but they probably had badges and whatnot. And they lined up their competitive gang. Chicago at the time had two big gangs, Capone's and the Southside Irish gang. And they lined them up, and this is the aftermath next. They're just kind of lined up. And one of my relatives, who, I don't even remember which one it was, but he was on the police force at the time. And we were talking about this. He said, "Oh, I get you a copy of the police reports." I said, that'd be kind of fun. So he sent me probably 200-300 pages of police reports, some handwritten, some typed on old typewriters, you can tell. And very, very redundant, where they went in and talked about how people got lined up and shot, and they were dead. So next. This is me and my grandfather when I was a kid. And I was his favorite among many, many grandkids, in part because we lived with them until I was 5, which is remarkable because there were uncles there and, you know, my mother and father and 5 kids. My older brother, Dick, who was 10 years older, he was the first grandchild, and he was my grandfather's apple in the eye. And then he got to be kind of a sassy teenager, and I took over as the favorite. And there's lots of privileges to that. Next. Al Capone. Before we get to Al Capone, I want to tell a couple stories that my wife already told. My grandfather and I, when I lived with him, we would go on walks down to the Grand Avenue shopping district. Now, Grand Avenue, it's like here. Every neighborhood has their own distinct qualities. My father grew up in the house that his father built, and when his father died, he bought his sisters out, at least theoretically, and we moved into that house. Prior to that, we lived with my grandparents, and as I mentioned, my grandfather and I would walk down Grand Avenue, and the first stop was a lamp store. 8-ish, 9-ish in the morning, and there was nobody buying lamps at that time. And we go in and he'd say, sit in this chair, I'll be back. And he would go into the back room and he'd disappear for a half hour or so. I found out many years later, because I was just kind of an obedient kid that did what I was told. I found out years later from my older brother that was the bookie joint. And he went in every day to place his bet and watch the ponies. However, they didn't like the sting, I guess. But he loved the ponies to his dying day. And would always make a bet, and my father would sometimes occasionally join him with his birthday and my mother's birthday for the Daily Dole. And I think one time they won $400 or so. But Al Capone is one of the godfathers. He was not the first one in Chicago. He was third or fourth. And he got his start going back to Hinky Dink Kenna and Bathhouse John. He was their bodyguard. So he was influential in politics as they were in the First Ward and so forth. But he moved out to Cicero, a suburb just west of Chicago, that became the center for the mob. Next. And there's Sam Giancana. Handsome dude. Next. Phyllis McGuire was one of his girlfriends. Some of you may remember the movies that she starred in. I think From Here to Eternity was one. She was a big glamorous one that allegedly also had a close relationship with John F. Kennedy, as did the next side. Next, which is Sam Giancana getting better looking by the day, with Marilyn Monroe. Also had something to do with Kennedy. And that first slide I showed you of Giancana, the caption for it disappeared, and I couldn't get it back on, but the caption was, quote, "We got Kennedy," end quote. So that fueled the rumors that the mob was behind the assassination of JFK, which, who knows, they might have been. Now, Giancana was the mob boss when I was pretty much growing up. Now, I'm going to show you Taylor Street in a little bit with Al's Italian Beef. Now, Taylor Street was Little Italy, and it was still the home of the first generation Italians who came over. And the second generation, maybe the third generation, moved out west, northwest, which is where I live, in the northwest part of Chicago. So the guys that were the worker bees and the mob lived in my neighborhood. A couple of them did, or the descendants did very well. I went to school with them. And the second guys would go to Elmwood Park. And then some would move to Oak Park like Giancana did. Now, my father was a roofer, and in the wintertime, he was often out of work. And there's no strike or anything, but he was often out of work. And occasionally, I guess, there was a strike, which is when he dislike unions because, you know, they'd be on strike for a while and then they'd get a 12% raise and 8 cents of that went to the union, so didn't quite make up for being out of work. But Johnny Batista was a milkman for Bourbons, and when I came of age, which was about 11, I guess, 12, I would be his assistant in the summer on his busy days, which were Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and I would get 50 cents an hour. Now, let me back up this. Johnny would count, unbeknownst to me, would, you know, count my family's milk with 5 kids, and, you know, he never collected. I didn't find that out until much later, and I'm pretty sure that assisting him for 50 cents an hour was, you know, totally not necessary. On his busy days, which started with him picking me up at 4:30 in the morning on the corner, and we would drive down to the Borden Dairy. We'd load up the milk truck and get big blocks of ice, and which reminded me of something I should have mentioned before. Get big blocks of ice and we chip away at it. So I got pretty good with, you know, handling ice, which might be genetic because my father met my mother as the deliverer of ice for the ice box. So I'm backtracking now. The Norwegian side of the family was, there were merchant marines and so forth, and they met in Chicago, thinking they head north to Minnesota or Wisconsin, which are enclaves of Norwegians and Swedes. But they stayed in Chicago. My father was coming from someplace out here, perhaps even Seattle, and he wired my mother, who at the time, or my grandmother, who at the time I think had 1 child, maybe 2. And she came in through the east, and, you know, Chicago looked like it was in the middle, so that's where they met. And then he started an ice and cartage company. So, unfortunately, he did not foresee refrigeration. So Jefferson Ice was the largest ice company in Chicago, and Hansen Ice was the second largest. Well, the only one that made it was Jefferson Ice. And he was then limited to cartage. My father, at the age of 12, was taken out of school, and he drove the big cartage truck, and he went to Indianapolis, St. Louis, and it was basically Hansen moving. Unlike the one here, it was smaller. But my father, you know, earned a living doing manual labor. Well, he was a Norwegian Lutheran, and my mother was an Irish Catholic, and my father delivered ice. And you know, I can think of a bad joke, but I'm not going to tell it. My father, who was a handsome dude, seduced my mother. My mother got pregnant with my older brother Dick, 10 years older, who only found out he was a bastard at my father's funeral when one of the Norwegian aunts said they got married in 1936. And he said, "That's impossible. I was born in 1935. Well, they might have gotten married by a justice of the peace. They had multiple marriages from, you know, Catholic priest to, I guess, a Lutheran minister and so forth. So, but my grandfather, for some reason, kind of insisted that my father step up to the plate and, you know, get married. And my father he did that at the age of 19. And subsequently had to work real hard to raise a family that kept growing. So it became a roofer and worked for the largest roofing company in the city of Chicago. And my mother became quite ill, so she was in and out of hospitals later on in life. And my father worked 3 jobs for a while, and then he would do all the grocery shopping, and he would come home and he would cook. He was an excellent cryptococa and cardamom bread. And he would make multiple loaves of cardamom bread and ruin 3/4 of them by putting raisins in them. To my taste, that was just awful. But they were always fresh out of the oven, the non-raisin ones that we would slather with butter and eat warm. Boy, you can't get better than warm cardamom bread with butter. Anyway, that's how they met. Johnny Batista and my dad were good friends when they were younger. In fact, Johnny Batista, I found out later, offered my dad, he said, you want to make $500, which back then was considerable. And all he had to do was drive a truck from Canada to Chicago, no questions asked. And my father prudently said, no, I don't think so. But one of the delivery spots on Johnny Batista's milk route was Armand's Pizzeria, an Italian restaurant in Elmwood Park, which also had a fair share of mafiosa. And I would go in, it was one of our early stops, I would load up the hand truck with gallons of milk and cream and et cetera, and then I would go in to the front refrigerator and stack them just right on the shelves of that refrigerator. Well, that was right next to the entrance and exit from the dining room, kitchen to the dining room. And you know those diamond windows that you can see, typically are in the restaurants, so people can see if somebody's on the other side of the swinging door. Well, I walked in and there was this huge man with his arms folded, watching me carry this in. And Johnny Batista came rushing in behind me, which he usually didn't do. And he said, Vince, I forgot there's a meeting. And I saw through the glass that Sam Giancana and his lieutenants were up in the dais. And, they had a meeting going on, a breakfast meeting for the mob, which Mayor Daley later on said there is no mob in Chicago. But, there was. So Vince said to me, you didn't see anything, did you, kid? Well, I was street smart enough to say, well, sure, I didn't see anything. He said, you're goddamn right, you didn't see anything. I'll get them out of here. And I got to the truck. It's one of the really only times I saw Johnny Batista shook. And he said, you didn't see anything? I said, no, sir. He said, good, you remember you didn't see anything, and don't ever talk about this. They're all dead, so I feel safe in telling you that story. But Arnold's also had very good pizza. Next. There was Sam Giancana's house. When I was in high school, when we got our driver's licenses, and we thought we were hot dogs, whoever had the license get the car on a Saturday night or Friday night, and we would drive down to Oak Park to this house, and you can see there's a partial wall around it, probably double bricked and bulletproof glass. We would pull up at 11 o'clock or so at night and yell things like, hey Sam, how you doing, Sam? Hey Sam. And one night, a group of my buddies pulled up, and out of nowhere, they said, came a bunch of guys with guns drawn. And they said to these 5 or 6 kids in the car, show us your driver's license, your ID. And they wrote it all down. And they said, Mr. Giancana is getting very tired of being disturbed. Tell your friends that we don't want any more disturbances. And if there are, we are holding you accountable, and we have your address and we have your names. And you will be accountable for any disturbance. These macho guys came back trembling, saying, please, no longer, let's not do that anymore. So we stopped. We teased them a little bit for getting caught, but you didn't want to mess around. I think it was our Carol, somebody was telling me about look, they paint houses, don't they? Well, the mob, the outfit, as it's called sometimes, had a painting company, and there was, when I was in zone sales school for Allstate, we had a new hire who was an accountant, and I was a temporary instructor at this or so, but you had to stay at this place, at the Holiday Inn for 2 weeks. And we shared a room, so when you share a room with somebody for 2 weeks, you get to know them pretty well. Turns out that he was mafia connected, and he was offered a full ride to whatever school he wanted. He went to Notre Dame. And the only stipulation was including a master's degree, the only stipulation was, he become a CPA and work for one of the legitimate companies that the mob owned. And he told me, he said, no, that's not a good idea, because once they get their hooks in you have to do whatever they want. And he told about a cousin of his who was an avid golfer, and when he was painting the inside of Giancana's house, he noticed that there was a brand new set of very fancy golf clubs. The state of the art and so forth. So he thought, well, I just borrow these over the weekend. So he borrowed them, and he played around the golf, and he forgot that they were in the trunk of his car when he went back to do the painting. He was called in to see either Giancana or one of his lieutenants, and said, do you happen to know where Mr. Giancana's golf clubs are? He goes, oh, yeah, they're in the trunk of my car, I forgot. Okay, well, you get them and bring them back in. So they brought him back in, and he did not clean them properly. So there was another strike against him, and they said, did you ask Mr. Giancana for permission? He said, no, I thought I just borrowed them, play around golf, bring them back, no harm, no foul. And they said, well, we consider that a bad move. So they broke his fingers to demonstrate how unhappy they were. It's going to ruin his golf game for a while. So the guy that I'm rooming with knew that story and said, they're the kind of people you really don't want to mess with. But they also, if they lived in these neighborhoods, they were the safest neighborhoods around. So next. This is the corpse of Sam Giancana in the basement of his house. And he was cooking dinner, and somebody shot him and killed him. The arrow is pointing to some kind of trophy that he had, I think. And the rest is the coroner, etc. Next. All right, these are the bosses. You can see, this is a partial list, but I wanted to get Sam Giancana on there. And they have funny names. Like, I don't know if you can read this. Anybody read those names? My eyes are not good, but things like Two Toes Benoni and Featherhead John, and Fatso so-and-so, all these names. And if you've ever seen the movie Ghost Dog, which is one of my favorite movies, and I understand it's going to be shown again sometime soon, the mob, it shows a mob meeting with these old guys, and they're waiting for somebody to show up. They start talking about American Indians and laughing about the strange names, like Sitting Bull, and they're all chuckling, and who can think of the silliest name? Why do they do that? And then somebody opens the door and says, sir, Two Toes Tony is here now, which is very ironic and I thought humorous. Next. This is also mob losses, I believe. Johnny Boss. The reason he's back is that at one time he was chief of detectives, another time he was chief of mob surveillance, and then later captain at the police station. But when he was chief of detectives, next, darn, when he was chief of detectives, I lived at when he was captain, I lived at Holy Family Church, which was on the left, at St. Ignatius. I'll get back to that. When he was in charge of mob surveillance, my mother, his sister, died. I was in high school, and we were at the Montclair Funeral Home, which I have a slide of. But I can see if it's next. Next. We'll go back. Next. Yeah. This is my neighborhood. And the Montclair Funeral Home, I think, is the road down in the center. I live south of there. Now, the Montclair Funeral Home, if you go west from there, just a half mile or so, you're in Elmwood Park, which is, and it's now the Montclair Catania Funeral Home. So back in my day, it was very clear. I mean, they were wonderful people. In fact, I went to school with Cookie Longetta, who later became the funeral director there. And I had a crush on her, and we delivered milk to there, we put it on the thing that they lifted corpses upstairs on, and pull the trigger, and it would go up. It's like a stillmeter or something. And north of that is Shavona Park. This is another side. I played softball. The Apaches, which the nuns considered us to be a gang. We were really into more athletics than gang activity, but we were very talented, and we used to play at all the parks. I played at Shavona Park quite often, and I found out later, and this is just a suspicion on my part, because I found out later that Robert Hansen, with 2 S's, about whom there is a movie, with Christopher Walken, I think, playing him. Robert Hansen is the most notorious spy in our country, and still serving time out west in maximum security and all that stuff. Am I running out of time?
I wonder if you wouldn't mind turning around and taking some questions, and we want to just whip through some more slides.
Let me whip through it.
Okay.
That's Moss's place my grandfather wrote. Next. I still have a copy of that. Al's Italian Beef on Taylor Street. The tradition is you have an Italian beef sandwich and go across the street to Mario's Italian Ice, and what a summer evening. He later worked on his garage, and then he built his own structure, which was garage-like but large, and he always had Chicago police there. I don't know if he gave away free sandwiches, but there were at least 3 or 4 Chicago cops at the Italian beef stand. Next. And this is Al with Jimmy Durante. Next. Al with Svengali. Next. Two-Ton Baker. I got to mention him. He was Two-Ton Baker, the music maker, on television. And next. There he is with his cohort. Next. And this is not my family, but it's representative of my brother and my cousin who boxed on Two-Ton Baker's show on Saturdays. Next. All right, let me go back. My brother and my cousin Jackie, who you saw earlier in police uniform as a rookie, would box on television, and Stuart Moss, who was Jackie's older brother, would referee, and they had these big gloves, and nobody had televisions back then, so we would go to Tan's Tavern. Tan opened his tavern very early for all the policemen getting off duty on the night shift, who would come and have their breakfast beers and so forth. So we would trundle down to Tan's Tavern, where I would get a pop or some kiddie drink, and everybody else would drink beer, and we'd watch my brother and my 2 cousins on television, which they were stars. Next, there are other characters I could talk about. Richard J. Daley, that's good. Michael M. Daly, his son, both mayors of Chicago for a long time. Next. Mike Royko, a columnist who wrote a book called The Voss on Mayor Daley, and a very witty, wonderful writer, whom I could talk about a lot, and Studs Terkel, who wrote dozens of books and interviewed lots of people, and was absolutely terrific human being. Next. So again, finish, Sardis, any questions?
Wow.
Thank you very much. Yes. Question?
Oh, thanks.
As someone close to a lot of policemen, perhaps you'd like to say a few words about the events surrounding the Democratic Convention in 1968.
Oh, yes. Well, I was a Jesuit at the time, and the Jesuits have a place in Omena, Wisconsin, a resort near Lake Michigan, and near a small Indian reservation. So it's semi-mandatory, well, it's mandatory that everybody go up and have 1 week of vacation there, or 10 days of vacation. And they'd rent a boat, and we'd go on boat rides and so forth. And, yeah, absolutely. After 2 days, it's like, okay, enough. Well, the convention problem went on, and we knew that from television. So some of us organized cars to go down to Chicago and quell the riots, I guess, whatever the heck we were thinking. And there was one carload of guys that was leaving, and Father W. Henry Kenny, our superior, called and he said, I want to talk to Hansen. Why me? So I picked up the phone and said, Father Kenny, how can I help you? He said, anybody think they're going to Chicago? And I said, well, yes. He said, I order you under your vow of holy obedience, which is it's a big deal. When you get ordered under your vow of holy obedience, you're flirting with the devil and hell and whipping yourself and so forth. There was one car that was all ready to go, and as I'm talking to Father Kenny, waving, and I said, well, there's one car that's, I think it's already left. He said, well, run after it and stop it. So I huffed and puffed into the phone and said, geez, I couldn't get him. He said, well, make an announcement there, anybody else that thinks they're going to Chicago, they are also under the vow of holy obedience, and we'll expel them, or whatever the threat was. My uncles, on the other hand, have a version of that where the hippies they caused a riot in Grant Park. They ran into the Conrad Hilton Hotel, and it's depending on who you think started it. It's material who started it. The ending was not happy. There were lots of beatings and so forth, and cops that got injured and hospitalized. And I think 1 or 2 cops got killed. So my uncles were not, they were not in favor of this whole thing.
Just out of curiosity, was anybody there in Chicago in '68? You were there? Ooh.
It was a mess. And, part of me is sorry I missed it, because I wanted to go down.
That's too bad you missed it.
Yeah.
And probably for the better.
Well, the closest thing I came to that was when Martin Luther King was assassinated. I had just finished giving a retreat to St. Dominic's Girl College, which was an adventure in itself. And we could see from the western suburbs the glow of red over the city. So I organized a group of guys, because I had worked in the inner city, and later on I moved there, worked kind of full-time while going to school. We saw the glow, knew the news. We all dressed up in our clerics, and we drove into the city. Now, what the hell we thought we were going to do, I have no idea. visit people we knew, and, you know, the contract buyers league was something that Jesuit started, and that's a whole other story. So we thought we would be okay until we got pulled over by the cops. And there were no cars on the expressway at this point. And they said, what the hell do you think you're doing? So they pointed us, we did a U-turn following them, U-turn going out of town. And there were people throwing bricks from the overpasses and stuff. And they said, we catch you again, you're going to jail. I said, okay.
Okay, thank you, Fred. We do need to wrap this up now. That was a very colorful history. And a little